Hey everyone, welcome back to Financial Clarity for Doctors. This is Rochelle van der Zanden here with Corey Janoff.
Yo, yo.
We get a lot of requests from folks asking us about budgeting. I think it's probably one of my least favorite things to get questions about just because I feel uncomfortable telling people stop spending money. Sometimes that is what they want to hear. But today we're going to spend a little bit of time just going through a few different strategies and ways that you can approach budgeting for yourself without having to have a financial planner beat you over the head about it. So we'll go through a few different strategies that we like to look at. I think for a lot of folks, it's not budgeting so much. It's a lack of budgeting. It's a lack of thought spent on what you're spending. Most people don't think about it. Like they have a certain amount of money, they spend a certain amount of money, and that's all it is. If they're not making enough money, maybe they have some credit card debt. If they are making enough money, maybe their savings is building a little bit. So the lack of thought about it, that's the thing that we really want to avoid. That's the biggest pitfall when it comes to budgeting, is just not thinking about it at all. Many people settle into a lot of their fixed expenses without thought too. So I think your home is probably going to be the biggest one, but also student loans and the payment that you commit to there. And they think about, okay, like this is what my bills are. I've committed to this, and they don't really think about it ahead of time. How is that going to affect my ability to meet my long-term goals or the amount of money that I have left over to spend on other things? And then they just kind of do what they can with the left. A lot of times, if you have money left over, it's like, ooh, let's get a nicer car. Let's commit to private school for the kids. And you're not really thinking about your future selves maybe or the other long-term goals that you may have. So we want to make sure that we're leaving enough room in the cash flow to make those things happen too. So we'll talk about a few different strategies that you can potentially use to do that today.
Yes. I think most people are familiar with the traditional budgeting methods where you set some predetermined allotments for different spending categories. Like I'm going to allow myself to spend this much on groceries, this much on entertainment, etc. Um, and I guess when income's tight and you're in college, med school, residency, and you really are on a limited, you know, amount of spending, it's like, all right, do I choose to go out to dinner or do I choose to, you know, go, you know, to this sporting event this week? I can't afford to do both, so we kind of have to make some tough decisions there. Or am I cool eating top ramen this week and using the extra money to go out to dinner with friends for one night? Like, but I think when income's tight, that can be beneficial. I think some challenges with the traditional budgeting methods, it's kind of like New Year's resolutions. They're tough to stick with, and it can also lead to overspending sometimes when you would have naturally spent less. We set this dollar figure, and that's what we anchor our minds to. All right, I can spend $300 this month on groceries, and that's your target. Keep in mind, budgeting, it's a limit, not a target, but we naturally see that number and think, okay, I can get all the way up to this. I've got some room to go, so let's go buy a few other things because I still have room in the budget, rather than just letting that roll over into savings or something else if you wouldn't otherwise bought it. I personally kind of prefer to budget backwards. So let's start looking at what are our big picture goals, and let's start putting enough money towards those goals. And with whatever's left, we can do whatever we want with, because we know our long-term goals are on track to being met. Um, if we're saving enough for retirement, saving enough for the kids to go to college, maybe we want to buy another home in a few years and we need to save up a little bit for a down payment. We're putting enough towards those various things and we're on track for that. Great. Spend whatever you want on groceries, spend whatever you want on vacations. Just don't go into credit card debt. Maintain your systematic savings plan and you'll be in good shape. I think when you're at a higher income level, have more cash flow, have more discretionary spending abilities, this is fantastic. Where Rochelle and I often, get a little discouraged is we'll run into people who are in practice making good income and they want to do the traditional budgeting because they're spending too much, and it's really difficult once you get to that level to really start scaling back enough. It's probably easier to actually earn more income than it is to cut expenses out of your life. So if you're still in training or med school listening to this, moment you get into practice, start setting enough aside for your goals, and then everything else you can upgrade from there. But it gets difficult if you upgrade your lifestyle first and then try and squeeze all of your financial goals into the equation. But what are your thoughts there, Rochelle?
Yeah, I think the strategy that you use is definitely dependent on where you're at in life. And I do think that even with a resident, you can try to control some of that excess spending to a certain extent because I see lots of people who are training that spend quite a bit of money. They really do. And there are other people who are ridiculously good budgeters, and maybe they don't have some of the long-term obligations like student loans and things like that, but they may be maxing out a Roth IRA every year. And I think one important thing to note is that when you're in training, we're probably not on track to meet our long-term goals, like because our long-term goals are going to be based on our attending salary, and we really can't save at that level yet. So it's important to do what you can at that point. And so, if you can make your goal like, hey, I just want to max out my Roth IRA, and then maybe you leave a little room in the budget to spend money on other things. I think there are some apps and things like that that help with the more traditional budgeting. So if that's your jam, if like that's the thing that's going to work for you, is seeing that number and knowing you like don't want to go over it, and like if you feel incentivized by things like that, there are lots of apps that are good like that. I know Mint works really well for a lot of people. Um, I think there's one, oh gosh, Corey, you remember any of the other
There's a
ones?
bunch. There's You Need a
There's,
Budget.
yeah,
I think Apple has their own
even
version.
one.
There's, I think, Personal Capital's one,
Personal,
but they're
that's the
also
other one I was thinking.
a money
Yeah.
management company. So if you sign up for their free app, which is a pretty cool app, but you're just going to get
Hmm.
hounded and bombarded by their representatives to, manage your investments. But
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many out there. It doesn't matter which one you use. Just go with whatever works for you.
Yeah. Whatever interface that you like best. Absolutely. And I think, with free apps in general, we expect to be bombarded by advertisements, I suppose. But yeah, then, as you get to other stages of your career, it's definitely a matter of just controlling that lifestyle inflation, like you were talking about, Corey. Um, yeah, because once you get there, there's no going back. And when you do start to inflate your lifestyle, if it gets a little out of hand, that also means that it's going to be really, really difficult to support that lifestyle when you're retired. So it's not just a problem for you right now, it's a future you problem also. So definitely something you want to tackle and be proactive about early on in your careers. So I think with those apps and things like that, and just with even if you're not going to use an app, looking at your statements, looking at your spending every month, and just having a good idea of what that looks like, being aware of your behavior is going to be the first step to making sure that it's reasonable. So you just want to take 3 seconds when you're making a purchase to acknowledge, like, hey, this is real money that I'm spending. I think especially when we're using cards all the time, there's not a lot of cash that we're using. It's so easy for money to change hands without even really thinking about what that means. Like, if you're spending $100 on something and you make $1,500 every 2 weeks, that's a good percentage of your paycheck that you are spending on that thing. So if it's worth it to you, absolutely. It doesn't mean don't do it. It just means like really taking a second to acknowledge that. And then I think the other piece is that with the apps that you can actually look at categories of spending that you have. So if you decide on a number that's reasonable for you, maybe it's, six, seven, $800 if it's just you on groceries. Maybe if it's a family, maybe and you're an attending, maybe it's something like $2,000 a month might be a little much, but you have to look at what's reasonable to you and kind of dial it back if at all possible. And you can just make small changes to get that in line sometimes. I do also like making sure that if you are in a relationship, you're doing some of this together because most of the time we're looking at your finances jointly. But if you're not on the same page when it comes to spending, it's going to be really difficult to control that at all. So if you can have a quarterly or a semi-annual sit down with your partner and just say, hey, let's look at what we spent the last 6 months. Is there anything in here that we regret at this point? Like maybe we take a second and don't do that the next time. but it's really beneficial to know. And that also gives you a chance to look at things, and if there's subscriptions you're using that maybe get very little use, maybe you can knock out some of those things that are recurring expenses. It can also be really helpful for retirement planning, just making sure that you're on track to meet your goals, and you can have a general assessment of the overall financial picture, but definitely looking at the spending should be a part of that.
Yes. Yeah, and make it fun too. Like, send the kids
Mhm.
to grandma and grandpa or get a babysitter or something and, make it a date night. Get a pizza, open a bottle of wine or two. And I think, we've had Carl Richards on the podcast before. He's really big on the no shame, no blame. He even recommends getting cheap trucker hats and writing no shame, no blame on it. So there's not going to be any judgment. We're just looking at it with open minds and all right, what did we spend? Wow, that's interesting. Not necessarily good or bad, and like you said, Rochelle, what can we cut out that we no longer need? And I think just the awareness is powerful, being aware of how much you're spending in certain things. And even every single day, just every time you buy something, just take 3 seconds without any guilt, just acknowledging, okay, yeah, I spent this much. I think you said I spent $8 on a burrito. That's interesting. And that's all. And not trying to feel guilty, not trying to change, your habits, but just being aware of what you're spending money on can kind of naturally alter your behavior, if that's the ultimate goal. Most people who want to try and create a budget or do budgeting are doing so because they aren't completely content with their current spending habits. They're trying to make some changes. So if you're just naturally aware of things, we're humans. We adapt pretty well and pretty easily. So you'll gradually migrate in the direction you want to go just from that awareness component.
I do think it's one of my favorite things once in a while when I have a client come to me who's like, "Why do I have so much money?" And like they haven't fully adjusted to their new income and they have relatively low fixed expenses. And that's kind of like the funnest budgeting. It's like, well, let's do a little extra for your long-term goals to make sure like you're in a really good spot. But when we get to the point where we're saving like a really good chunk of your income, we're being really aggressive about savings, then maybe you get to spend a little more. And that could be like the flip side of budgeting. And it absolutely happens once in a while where it's like, yeah, I mean, you can afford to spend more. Like you're in an okay spot. And for some folks, like that comes up. Most of those folks are the ones that don't have kids. I will say that. Like if you have kids, it's so much easier to spend all of the money that you're making. That being said, I think we're talking a lot about the little things like groceries and burritos and things like that. But the things that will have the largest impact on your monthly cash flow and your budget are going to be the big items. So it's housing, it's childcare, maybe to a lesser extent your car payments, things like that. Those are the ones where if you keep those reasonable, like then everything else should be easier to fall into place. So, just as some rough guidelines, ideally you can keep your housing payment and that includes like mortgage, rent, your taxes, your insurance if you're owning, all of that kind of stuff below about 20% of your gross income. So, take that number before taxes, 20% of that. If you can keep your housing expense below that, then you should be able to fit the other expenses in okay. And that can be different for some folks. Like if you have a big student loan payment, that's something you really want to take care of, your budget still could be a little tight. But generally speaking, 20% or lower is a good benchmark to shoot for. And then, if we take an example, if you're making $200,000 per year, that's about $3,300 per month. And depending on where you live, that should be pretty reasonable, pretty doable. I know the real estate market is kind of going crazy right now, so it's been a little difficult for people to get into homes. But most of the time, in most areas, that should be pretty doable. And then, if you have young children and there's childcare costs, there to a certain extent, like there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But doing whatever you can to minimize that cost and recognizing that it is short term if you're not going to be doing private school long term. And childcare costs are going to be one of the biggest expenses that you have when you have kids.
I think that's for the housing piece. These are just rough guidelines. That 20%, keep your housing costs below 20% of your income. But if you have several children, all young and in childcare, or maybe you have a nanny because it's cheaper to have a nanny than have 3 kids in daycare at once, and then you have a decent sized student loan balance that you're trying to pay off, the housing is one that you can control more, and trying to keep that housing costs lower, well below that 20% of your income mark until the student loans are gone, until the kids are in school and you don't have that high childcare cost expense anymore. That's when we take a sigh of relief and say, okay, now that these expenses are behind us, now we can move into the more desirable home in the nicer neighborhood. But we just got to tough it out for a handful of years until we get to that point. So
Yeah. Yep.
uh, another thing I like to do is, the housing piece is a big one. That's going to be your biggest expense, most likely, outside of taxes and children in your life. So if you can, the less money you spend on housing, the more money you have for other things. But all of your other expenses, ideally, if you're looking at it as a percentage of income, if it's exceeding 10% of your income, really, if it's more than 5% of your income, we kind of have to take a look and scratch our heads a little bit. If you're making 200,000 a year and spending 10% of that, so 20,000 a year on, say, a car, that's a pretty expensive car for your income. If you're spending, what does that amount to, like 1,600 a month in car payments?
Hmm.
So, let's get a little bit more realistic on that one. Um, and other stuff like the groceries, the dining out, entertainment, that can be a big one. The travel budget, with the pandemic, who knows where we'll be with things once this podcast gets released. And when we're recording, the Delta variant is wreaking havoc, and a lot of states are re-implementing mask mandates and restrictions again. But once travel's like a normal thing, that can be one where you spend a lot of money. So,
Hmm.
again, keeping it into a single digit percentage of income, ideally. And, if you're spending more than 5 or 10% of your income on groceries, we kind of have to ask ourselves, what are we eating that's so expensive?
What are we
Uh,
drinking?
yeah, what are we drinking? But I think the other one, retirement, that's when we want to save more than 20% of our income. And kind of getting back to the backwards budgeting, if we're putting enough away for all of our goals, we're in good shape. So, if we can save at least 20% of our income for retirement, and make your goals part of your budget. We're putting this much towards these various things. That'll help you stay on track for achieving the things you want to achieve.
Hmm. The retirement savings is one that's allowed to be more than 5 or 10% of your budget for sure.
It better be more than 5 or 10%.
It better be. It better be. Yeah, I think another one that sometimes up being a big line item that's related to the long-term goals is the college savings. So if you do have young kids, a lot of times you need to be putting a good chunk of money away, especially if you want to be able to bankroll the kind of education that you got as a medical professional. If you want them to be able to go to med school, if you want to be able to put them through Harvard undergrad, that is going to be very expensive and will be a big chunk of your monthly budget. And if you want to support that, it's either, we're doing it proactively right now, or we're paying a lot out of pocket when they get to school age. So one way or another, it's going to be a significant part of the budget at some point in time.
For sure. Um, yeah, I think the big things, if you're still in training, just try and avoid the credit card debt. You can use credit cards, just don't carry a balance month to month. Max out that Roth IRA. If you can do anything beyond that, fantastic. The more, the better. But just stay out of debt and have a little bit in savings is the goal. Once you're in practice, let's make sure we're setting enough aside for our various financial goals, so we're on the right track to achieving those goals in a timely manner. And as long as we're doing that, the traditional budgeting of limiting yourself to this amount each month for various things isn't really as imperative, because you're setting enough aside for your goals. The rest, it's on track, so we can do what we want with the rest and not feel dirty about it. But Anything else you can think of, Rochelle, that's worth adding here?
No, that's the treat yourself moment. I like that one. When you're there, don't feel guilty about it anymore. Yeah.
For sure.
Yep.
All right. Well, I guess we'll chalk this one up as a little bit shorter and sweeter. But don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. So thanks for listening.
We would love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing podcast@thefinitigroup.com or by following Finity Group on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Finity Group LLC.
You can follow me on Twitter at Corey Janoff CFP, Instagram at Corey Janoff, or on LinkedIn under my name, Corey Janoff.
You can follow me on Twitter at Rochelle Finance, or on Instagram, Vanderzanden Rochelle, or on LinkedIn under my name, Rochelle Vanderzanden.
Check out all of the podcast episodes on the finitygroup.com/podcast, on our Finity Group YouTube channel, or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to check out our financial clarity blog at thefinitygroup.com/blog.